Hi and welcome. My name is Johan Larsson. I am the CEO of SkartaNYAB. I was appointed CEO on April 1st, the day after the merger between Skarta and NYAB. I have a background as a versatile entrepreneur, but the lion's share of my time has always been in this industry, in the industry SkartaNYAB is in. A little bit about us. Short introduction. SkartaNYAB is a builder of a clean future with decades of experience in complex and demanding projects. We are enabling green transition in the Nordics by providing engineering, construction and maintenance services to public and private sector. Clients regarding the construction of renewable energy and sustainable infrastructure. We have approximately 350 employees in Finland and Sweden, a balance sheet exceeding 300 million euros. And last year's figures pro forma, you can see that roughly 70% of our revenue comes from Sweden, where we had a EBITDA of 10.9%. And in Finland, we had a EBITDA of 5.7%. Our financial guidance for this year is a revenue of approximately 225 to 245 million euros. That's not pro forma. And we have a anticipation to reach another 20 million euros. Contemplated the establishment of a joint venture. SkartaNYAB has also convened an extraordinary general meeting to change the name of the company to NYAB, which has been the original name in Sweden. And the general meeting is held tomorrow on November 22nd. So our main markets and focus areas are infrastructure. In infrastructure, it's road, railway, maintenance and bridges. Energy, of course, renewable energy and industrial. The objectives of the group, our long-term financial targets. Annual organic growth, 7%. As it looks for now, we will have an annual organic growth this year exceeding 30%. The reason why we have a pretty low, easy to reach target for being an entrepreneurial, fast-growing company on annual organic growth is because of the large market, and we must make sure we always focus on profitability before revenue. But anyhow, most likely we will every year beat our annual organic growth goal. Our EBITDA margin exceeding 10%. We are anticipating to not do so well that we will do more than double digits. That would mean that we would earn 100%. But we will most likely exceed 10%. That also has to do with the already told about joint venture. Equity ratio about 45%. Now it looks like we are just above 73%. And dividend exceeding 30% of adjusted net profit. Looks doable concerning our low capex and great cash flow. We just launched 3 strategic objectives. Continuing profitable growth, that is the main cornerstone. Accelerating renewable energy project monetization. Also well in work of doing that, strengthening an entrepreneurial culture, which is very much a big part of us. It's in our DNA and in our soul. We are entrepreneurs. There are many ways to strengthen that culture. One way is to do the acquisitions we do in the way that we do, meaning we find entrepreneurial companies, do the deal mainly with share swap to get the entrepreneurs' drive into the company. So we will continue with acquisitions, but we will always be very selective in what companies we merger with or buy. So the company has a cherry-picked order book, and we concentrate on non-cyclical markets. If you look at the Swedish market, it's growing. The national plan published this summer is record high with investments for the coming decade. You can see the figures yourself there. Of course, this is a very good environment to operate in. Also, of course, it's not good enough that the market is good. We, of course, have to do our share. And how we do that and how we have done that is illustrated pretty well with these figures. NYAB has had exceptionally profitable growth with a 4-year average of 10% EBIT margin. One of the reasons why we are able to do that is because we cherry-pick our order book by having a lot of perennial contracts. We don't get in the need to just win new jobs. We can choose the right jobs that suits our organization, and that's very important and something we will work hard with in our continuous growth. Well, nothing new. I guess many of you have heard about this. Northern Sweden is experiencing over 100 billion euros of investments in green transition. We participate in a few of these, and of course, these projects entail investments in areas where the company has a strong presence, surrounding infrastructure, etc. So our very good profitable growth comes from a more normal market situation, and the market is growing. North of Sweden is one of our 2 strong footholds in Sweden. The other one is in Stockholm, where the driver, of course, is urbanization. Then we have a diverse expertise in the value chain of renewable energy. This is also very publicly known that uncertainty in the energy markets and an unstable geopolitical situation have accelerated the need for projects to improve energy self-sufficiency. Wind power productions is growing rapidly. We're getting into real high numbers. And the EU strategy for solar power is something that I personally really agree on. We have a super source in the sun, so let's take care of it. And because of this, transmission capacity must be increased. It's big investments coming up in both Finland and Sweden. So, with our diverse expertise, we have in 2022 started projects like Karaka Wind Farm, Lumivaara Wind Farm, and Pajo-Peräkangas Wind Farm. Total of 47 turbines. We do the balance of plant construction. We now have a power network construction business unit that we established this spring, and that help us in our offering with substations, transformers, and transmission lines. We have made 2 strategic acquisitions last year, roughly. Sijoituskohteena, who is an expert in engineering and also design. And our most recent acquisition, PowerForce, at the end of Q3, provides services regarding power installations for industry and wind power. This also has a lot of synergies with our current business. And I would say regarding acquisitions that most likely we will be in this region, we will do acquisitions of a couple of companies every year. But only the right companies, of course. SkartaNYAB develops products that improve energy self-sufficiency. As earlier mentioned, the initial business plan of the joint venture that we have published indicates more than 500 megawatts of projects in coming 5 years. We have our own concept, Near Energy, that is a cost-effective way to provide locally produced renewable energy for municipalities and industry. So this is a big part of our future. Our reasoning behind our intentions to set up this joint venture, to put it simple, reducing our ownership by being able to increase our speed with several 100% with the right partner. When it comes to solar projects, we have among the largest ones in Finland, Utajärvi and Hitura. So I guess you figured this out already. But anyhow, why invest in the company? We have a proven track record of exceptionally profitable growth in Swedish infrastructure markets as well as energy markets. We have a strong presence in growing markets of Norrbotten region, and our diverse expertise in the value chain of renewable energy will pay off very well. To sum it up, we are exposed to markets with high underlying demand, growing markets with high underlying demands, counter-cyclical markets, and booming markets. Key figures of the group. So this is no pro forma figures, so just to make clear, NYAB figures for the first quarter aren't here, and of course the acquisition of PowerForce is not in our official statement. Concerning our goal of reaching a double-digit EBITDA, I would like to focus on the last quarter, Q3, where you see that we have a revenue of 90 million euros, exceeding 90 million euros. That's before, without PowerForce. And our earnings are on that level without having any monetization of our renewable project portfolio. We have only taken costs and investments. And now we have sort of a market value of that adventure. So it looks good. We are in a very stable financial position, which is important because then we can grasp all opportunities, good business opportunities we see. And when it comes to our shareholders, you see that we have a high percentage of the ownership is in board and management. Of course, that secures performance and dedication. We have a lot of foreign shareholders, mainly Swedish, is my best guess. I dare to say that, even though we don't have the exact numbers. And we have a lot of Finnish shareholders as well, 16%. Of course, a lot of board and management ownership are Finns as well. So the number of shareholders are only to show the trend and how much the number of owners are growing, since all foreign shareholders are nominee registered. We don't have the account for them. But you can make your own guess if we have 27% of other foreign shareholders and 16% is other Finnish shareholders, and Finnish shareholders are accounted. So that's who we are. Thank you for listening. And thank you for letting me prove how much we value time. So I have shown by being time effective, also cost effective, by doing this presentation. Hope to see you in our coming general meeting.